The grandfather clock in the marble foyer chimed 11 times, each hollow note echoing through the silence of the Harrington mansion like a funeral bell. Nathaniel sat motionless in his leather chair, staring at the untouched dinner growing cold on the mahogany table before him. The formal dining room, once filled with Sarah's laughter and little Thomas's excited chatter about his day at kindergarten, now felt cavernous and suffocating. 365 days. One full year since the black ice had claimed them both on their way to Thomas's school Christmas pageant. Nathaniel had been in Singapore, closing a merger that would add another $100 million to his company's portfolio. He'd promised to catch the next flight home, promised he'd make it in time to see Thomas dressed as a shepherd, holding his crooked staff and beaming with 5-year-old pride. The promise had died with them on Highway 101. Nathaniel's fingers traced the rim of his untouched wine glass, the crystal singing softly under his touch. Around him, the house stood like a monument to a life that no longer existed. Sarah's reading glasses still lay folded on the end table beside her favorite chair. Thomas's toy fire truck remained parked under the coffee table, where he'd left it that final morning, red paint chipped from countless rescue missions across the hardwood floors. The weight of silence pressed against his chest until breathing became a conscious effort. He'd kept everything exactly as it was, unable to face the finality of packing away their belongings. The housekeeper, Carmen, had suggested gently that perhaps it might be time to make some changes, but Nathaniel had shut down the conversation with a look that could freeze summer rain. His phone buzzed against the table. Another message from his assistant about tomorrow's board meeting. Another reminder that life continued its relentless march forward even when everything meaningful had stopped. He didn't reach for it. The Harrington Industries empire that had once consumed his days now felt as empty as the chair across from him, where Sarah used to sit, teasing him about working too late and stealing bites from his plate when she thought he wasn't looking. Nathaniel pushed back from the table, the chair's legs scraping against marble with a sound that seemed too loud in the oppressive quiet. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured gardens, his reflection a ghost against the darkness outside. At 43, he looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, his dark hair showing silver that hadn't been there a year ago. Success meant nothing when there was no one left to share it with. The house felt like a beautiful prison, every room holding memories that cut like broken glass. Yet he couldn't bring himself to leave, couldn't abandon the last place where they'd all been together, where Thomas had taken his first steps and Sarah had danced in the kitchen while making Sunday morning pancakes. Tomorrow would bring another day of meetings, another day of pretending that building his business empire still mattered. But tonight, on this anniversary of everything ending, Nathaniel Harrington sat alone with his ghosts and wondered if this hollow ache in his chest would ever fade, or if this was simply what the rest of his life would feel like. The sound of the kitchen door opening drifted through the mansion at 7:30 the next morning, followed by Carmen Santos's familiar footsteps across the tile floor. Nathaniel remained at his desk in the home office, surrounded by financial reports that blurred together into meaningless numbers. He'd been awake since 4, unable to escape the dreams that brought Sarah and Thomas back only to steal them away again when consciousness returned. Carmen's routine never varied. She would start the coffee, check the refrigerator, and begin the quiet work of maintaining a house too large for one grieving man. For 3 years before the accident, she had managed the Harrington household with gentle efficiency, becoming as much a part of the family fabric as the Persian rugs and crystal chandeliers. Sarah had trusted her completely, often joking that Carmen knew where everything belonged better than she did. This morning, however, something was different. Nathaniel heard a second set of footsteps, lighter and quicker, accompanied by the soft thud of what sounded like a backpack hitting the kitchen counter. A child's voice floated through the house, speaking rapid Spanish in hushed tones. Carmen appeared in his office doorway, her weathered hands clasped in front of her navy uniform dress. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered many storms and emerged stronger. Her dark hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, but worry lines creased her forehead as she looked at him apologetically. "Mr. Harrington," she said softly, "I am very sorry, but my usual babysitter had to go to the hospital last night. Her daughter fell and broke her arm. I have no one else to watch Isabella today, and I cannot miss work. She will be very quiet, I promise. You will not even know she is here." Nathaniel looked up from his papers, seeing Carmen clearly for the first time in weeks. Behind her concern for her employment, he recognized something familiar in her eyes. The careful way she held herself, the protective tension in her shoulders when speaking about her child. It was the same stance he had once taken when discussing Thomas with business associates, that fierce parental instinct to shield your child from any possible harm. "How old is she?" he asked, his voice rusty from disuse. 6 years old, Mr. Harrington. She will stay in the kitchen with me, or perhaps in the small sitting room with her coloring books. She knows to be very quiet when adults are working. Through the doorway, Nathaniel caught a glimpse of small sneakers beneath the kitchen island and heard the whispered sound of pages turning. The child was already trying to make herself invisible, understanding instinctively that her presence was an intrusion in this house of silence and sorrow. "It's fine, Carmen," he said, returning his attention to the reports. "Just make sure she doesn't touch anything in the other rooms." Relief flooded Carmen's face. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. She will not be any trouble, I promise you." As Carmen retreated to the kitchen, Nathaniel tried to focus on the quarterly projections spread across his mahogany desk. But concentration proved impossible with the knowledge that a 6-year-old girl now occupied his sanctuary of grief. Every small sound from the kitchen seemed amplified. The scrape of a chair being moved, the gentle clink of dishes, and underneath it all, the barely audible hum of a child's voice singing softly to herself. The melody was unfamiliar but sweet, rising and falling with the unconscious joy that only children possess. It had been so long since music of any kind had filled these rooms that the sound felt foreign and somehow dangerous, threatening the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart. Nathaniel pressed his palms against his temples, trying to block out the innocent intrusion, but the soft singing continued, weaving through the silence like sunlight through heavy curtains. The soft humming from the kitchen stirred memories that Nathaniel had spent months trying to bury beneath spreadsheets and merger documents. Thomas used to hum the same way while building elaborate towers with his wooden blocks, his small tongue poking out in concentration as he balanced each piece with the serious focus of an architect. Sarah would watch from the doorway, her hand resting on her rounded belly during those precious weeks when they thought they might have another child to fill their home with laughter. The miscarriage had come at 12 weeks, stealing away dreams of sibling rivalry and shared bedtime stories. But Thomas had been enough, more than enough, with his endless questions about everything from why clouds moved to whether fire trucks ever got tired of being read. Nathaniel had made a promise then to be more present, to say yes more often to requests for piggyback rides and impromptu trips to the park. He had kept that promise for exactly 8 months before the Singapore deal demanded his attention, and Sarah had kissed him goodbye at the airport, Thomas clinging to his leg and making him swear to bring back something special from his trip. The something special was still sitting in his briefcase upstairs, a small wooden elephant that Thomas would never hold. From the kitchen came the sound of Isabella's chair scraping against the floor, followed by Carmen's gentle voice asking if she needed to use the bathroom. The domestic normalcy of it felt like sandpaper against his raw nerves. This had been Sarah's domain once, filled with the controlled chaos of family life. Thomas's artwork had covered the refrigerator like colorful snowflakes, and Sarah's herb garden had thrived on the windowsill above the sink, filling the room with the scent of basil and rosemary. Now Carmen maintained the kitchen with professional efficiency, but it felt sterile, without Sarah's half-finished crossword puzzles scattered across the breakfast nook or Thomas's forgotten juice boxes hiding behind the fruit bowl. The silence had become Nathaniel's companion, predictable and safe in its emptiness. But today that silence was broken by the whispered conversation between Carmen and her daughter, conducted in a mixture of Spanish and English that Thomas had been starting to pick up from his friends at school. He He had come home one afternoon proudly announcing that he could count to 10 in Spanish, demonstrating with the serious pride of a 5-year-old who had conquered a mountain. Sarah had laughed and applauded, then spent the next hour teaching them both basic phrases while they waited for dinner to finish cooking. Nathaniel could still hear her voice correcting his pronunciation of gracias, her laughter bubbling up when he stumbled over the rolling R's. That kitchen had been the heart of their home, the place where homework was completed at the breakfast bar, while Sarah cooked and Nathaniel stole taste from whatever was simmering on the stove. Through his office doorway, Nathaniel caught a glimpse of Isabella's small form perched on one of the kitchen stools, her dark hair falling in waves around a face that held the same quiet strength he recognized in her mother. She was coloring with intense concentration, her small hand gripping a red crayon as she carefully stayed within the lines of what appeared to be a drawing of a house. The sight hit him like a physical blow. Thomas had sat in that exact spot countless mornings, tongue poking out in concentration as he worked on his pictures for refrigerator display. His artwork had ranged from stick figure families to elaborate dinosaur battles, each one treated with the reverence due a masterpiece. Sarah had saved every single drawing in a box in the attic, unable to throw away any evidence of their son's creative development. Nathaniel forced his attention back to the financial reports, but the numbers swam before his eyes. The sound of Isabella's crayon scratching against paper seemed to echo through the house, each stroke a reminder of everything he had lost and everything this kitchen used to be when it pulsed with the rhythm of family life rather than the hollow efficiency of survival. By noon, the house had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Carmen moved through her tasks with practiced quiet, while Isabella remained stationed at the kitchen counter with her coloring books and a small collection of crayons as she arranged and rearranged with the careful precision of someone much older than 6. Nathaniel had managed to lose himself in quarterly revenue projections when he heard Carmen's footsteps approaching his office. "I need to go upstairs to change the linens, Mr. Harrington," she said from the doorway. "Isabella will stay in the kitchen. She has her lunch and will not move from her seat." Nathaniel nodded without looking up, but something in Carmen's tone made him glance toward the kitchen. Isabella sat perfectly still on her stool, small legs swinging gently as she focused intently on her coloring. There was something almost heartbreaking about how carefully she was trying to be invisible, as if she understood that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. 20 minutes passed before Carmen's footsteps echoed down the main staircase. In the intervening silence, Nathaniel became acutely aware of Isabella's movements, the soft rustle of pages turning, the gentle tap of a crayon being set down, the whispered conversation she was having with herself as she worked, too quiet for him to make out the words but musical in its rhythm. When Carmen returned to the kitchen, Nathaniel heard a brief exchange in Spanish, followed by Isabella's light footsteps crossing the marble foyer. He tensed, wondering if the child was going to venture into forbidden territory, but the footsteps stopped just outside his office door. There was a moment of complete silence, then the soft sound of paper sliding across marble. Curiosity finally overcame his desire to remain isolated. Nathaniel rose from his desk and walked to the doorway, looking down to find a piece of paper that had been carefully slipped under his door. Isabella was already retreating toward the kitchen, her small form moving with the quick, nervous energy of someone who had just completed a dangerous mission. He picked up the paper, expecting to find a random scribble or perhaps a house like the one she had been working on earlier. Instead, he found himself staring at a drawing that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. It was clearly the work of a 6-year-old, with the slightly wobbly lines and disproportionate features that marked all children's art. But there was something in the careful attention to detail that spoke of genuine effort and thought. The drawing showed a man sitting at a desk, his face colored with a blue crayon that Isabella had used to suggest sadness. Around the edges of the paper, she had drawn small hearts in red and yellow, and at the bottom, in carefully printed letters that slanted slightly downward, she had written the words for the sad man. Nathaniel stared at the drawing for a long moment, something stirring in his chest that he had thought was permanently frozen. When was the last time someone had seen his pain clearly enough to acknowledge it? His business associates treated him with careful professional distance. His few remaining friends had stopped calling months ago, worn down by his rejection of their well-meaning invitations and concern. Even Carmen, despite her kindness, maintained the respectful boundary between employer and employee. But this 6-year-old child, who barely knew him and had every reason to be intimidated by his cold silence, had seen straight through to the grief he carried and responded with the pure empathy that only children possessed. She had not tried to fix him or cheer him up or tell him that time would heal all wounds. She had simply acknowledged that he was sad and offered the only comfort she could give. From a kitchen came the sound of Isabella's voice asking Carmen something in Spanish, her tone anxious. Carmen's response was gentle but firm, and Nathaniel realized that the child was probably being scolded for leaving her designated area. He looked down at the drawing again, at the careful hearts she had drawn around the edges like a border of hope. For the first time in months, Nathaniel felt something crack in the ice that had formed around his heart. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. A hairline fracture in the wall he had built to keep the world at bay, created by a child's innocent recognition of his pain and her simple desire to offer comfort to a stranger who lived surrounded by beautiful things but seemed to have nothing at all. The drawing remained on Nathaniel's desk for the rest of the afternoon, a splash of color against the stark white of his financial documents. Every time his eyes drifted to it, he felt that strange stirring in his chest, as if something long dormant was trying to remember how to beat properly. When evening approached, and he heard Carmen preparing to leave, he found himself walking to the kitchen for the first time in months. Carmen was packing Isabella's crayons into a small plastic container, her movements efficient but gentle. Isabella sat quietly on her stool, swinging her legs as she watched her mother work. Both of them looked up when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, surprise flickering across Carmen's weathered features. "Thank you for being patient today, Mr. Harrington," Carmen said, closing Isabella's coloring book. "I know this was not what you wanted in your home." Nathaniel glanced at Isabella, who was studying him with the frank curiosity that only children possessed. She showed no fear, only interest, as if he were a puzzle she was trying to solve. The innocence in her dark eyes reminded him painfully of Thomas, who had looked at the world with that same open wonder before learning that not all adults were safe or kind. "She left me a drawing," Nathaniel said quietly. Carmen's expression shifted to concern. "Isabella, I told you to stay at the counter. You cannot bother Mr. Harrington when he is working." "No," Nathaniel said quickly, seeing Isabella's face fall. It wasn't a botheration. It was thoughtful. Relief washed over Isabella's features, and she offered him a shy smile that tugged at something deep in his chest. Carmen watched the exchange with careful attention, her protective instincts clearly engaged. In that moment, Nathaniel recognized the same fierce love he had once carried for Thomas, the way a parent's entire world could shift based on their child's happiness or distress. "How long have you been raising her alone?" he asked, the question emerging before he could stop it. Carmen's hands stilled on the crayon container. "Since she was 8 months old, Mr. Harrington. Her father died in a construction accident when the scaffolding collapsed. Isabella never knew him, but I tell her stories, so she knows what a good man he was." The parallel hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. Here was another parent navigating loss, another family reshaped by tragedy. But where he had retreated into isolation and bitterness, Carmen had somehow maintained her warmth and strength. She had continued working, continued caring for others, continued building a life for her daughter despite her own grief. "That must have been very difficult," he said, his voice softer than it had been in months. Carmen nodded, her eyes distant with memory. "The first years were the hardest. I would watch other families at the park, the fathers pushing their children on swings, and I would feel so angry. Why did Isabella have to grow up without her papa when other children had both parents? But then I realized that my anger was stealing joy from the time I had with her. Miguel would not want you to waste our life together being sad about what we lost instead of grateful for what we still had." Her words settled into the kitchen's silence like stones dropping into deep water. Nathaniel found himself looking at Isabella again, seeing not just a child who reminded him of his loss, but a little girl who had also been touched by tragedy, yet somehow remained full of light and curiosity. She had never known her father, yet she had felt moved to offer comfort to a grieving stranger. "It is hard to be grateful when everything hurts," Nathaniel said, the admission escaping before he could censure it. Carmen met his eyes with understanding that went deeper than words. "Yes, Mr. Harrington. But Isabella taught me that grief shared is grief halved, and joy shared is joy doubled. She does not remember her father, but she remembers every person who has shown her kindness. Children forgive us for being broken if we remember to see the world through their eyes sometimes." Isabella had been listening to this exchange with the serious attention that children gave to adult conversations they sensed were important. Now she slid down from her stool and approached Nathaniel with careful steps, holding something small in her hands. "This is for you too," she said quietly, extending a red crayon toward him, "in case you want to draw something happy." Over the next few days, Isabella's babysitter remained hospitalized with complications from her daughter's accident, which meant the little girl continued to accompany Carmen to work. Nathaniel found himself unconsciously listening for her quiet presence, the soft humming that had become a subtle soundtrack to his morning routine, the gentle scrape of her crayons against paper, the whispered conversations with her mother that floated through the house like distant music. Each morning, he would find a new drawing slipped under his office door. A yellow sun with an oversized smile. A rainbow that stretched across the entire page in careful, wavy strokes. A cat that looked more like a purple cloud with whiskers, but with "Happy Cat" written underneath in Isabella's careful print. She never lingered to see his reaction, never demanded acknowledgement, simply offered these small gifts and retreated to her designated space at the kitchen counter. On Thursday morning, Nathaniel was reviewing acquisition contracts when he heard unfamiliar sounds from the kitchen. Instead of Isabella's usual quiet activity, there was shuffling, the scrape of a chair being moved, and Carmen's voice speaking in concerned Spanish. Curious despite himself, he rose from his desk and moved toward the kitchen, stopping just outside the doorway where he could observe without being seen. Isabella was standing on a kitchen chair that she had pushed against the counter, stretching on her tiptoes to reach something on the upper shelf. Carmen was at the far end of the kitchen, loading the dishwasher with her back to her daughter. The little girl's small fingers barely grazed a glass that sat near the edge, and Nathaniel could see the precarious wobble as she tried to pull it down. "Careful," he said, stepping into the kitchen just as the glass began to slip. Isabella startled, the glass tumbling from her grasp. Without thinking, Nathaniel lunged forward and caught it before it could shatter against the marble floor. His movement brought him close enough to Isabella that he could steady her with his other hand as she swayed on the chair, her dark eyes wide with surprise and relief. Carmen spun around at the sound, taking in the scene with immediate understanding. "Isabella, what did I tell you about climbing on furniture?" she said, but her tone held more relief than anger. She quickly moved to lift her daughter down from the chair. "I was just trying to get water," Isabella said in a small voice, her lower lip trembling slightly. "I was thirsty and did not want to bother anyone." The explanation hit Nathaniel squarely in the chest. This child had been so concerned about being a burden that she had risked injury rather than ask for help with something as basic as a drink of water. He looked down at her small form, recognizing the careful way she held herself, the resignation in her posture that suggested she was used to making herself as small and undemanding as possible. "You should have asked," he said gently, setting the glass on the counter. "Getting water is not a bother." Isabella looked up at him with those frank, curious eyes, seeming to weigh his words against her experience. "I did not want to interrupt your important work," she said. "Mama says you have very important things to do, and we must be quiet like little mice." Carmen's face flushed with embarrassment. "Isabella, Mr. Harrington does not want to hear about mice." But Nathaniel found himself crouching down to Isabella's level, bringing his eyes level with hers. "Being thirsty is important too," he said. "More important than most of the things on my desk. Next time, you can ask me or your mother for help." That is what adults are supposed to do for children. Isabella studied his face with the intensity that children brought to evaluating adult sincerity. After a moment, she nodded solemnly. "Okay," she said. "Thank you for catching my cup. I would have been very sad if it broke into a million pieces." Nathaniel filled the glass with water and handed it to her, watching as she drank with the focused attention that small children brought to simple tasks. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and offered him another of those shy smiles that seemed to bypass all his carefully constructed defenses. "Tomorrow I will draw you a picture of a man catching a cup," she announced, "so you can remember that you are very fast and very nice." As she skipped back to her coloring station, Nathaniel remained crouched by the counter, struck by the realization that somewhere in the last few minutes, the tight knot in his chest had loosened just enough for him to breathe a little deeper. Friday morning brought an unexpected change to the house's rhythm. Instead of Isabella's usual soft humming, Nathaniel heard something that stopped him mid-sentence during a conference call with his Tokyo office. The sound was quiet but unmistakable. Muffled sobs coming from the kitchen, the kind of heartbroken crying that only children could produce when their world suddenly felt too big and unfair. He ended the call abruptly, much to his assistant's confusion, and walked toward the kitchen with purposeful steps. Carmen was nowhere to be seen, probably upstairs changing linens, as was her Friday routine. Isabella sat hunched over the breakfast counter, her small shoulders shaking as she stared down at something in her hands. "What's wrong?" Nathaniel asked, his voice gentler than it had been in months. Isabella looked up with tear-streaked cheeks, holding the broken pieces of what had once been a small plastic horse. The toy was bright pink with a flowing mane, obviously well-loved based on the worn spots where small fingers had gripped it countless times. One of the legs had snapped clean off, leaving a jagged edge that spoke of sudden, irreversible damage. "My horse is broken," she whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I dropped her when I was trying to put her in my backpack, and now she cannot stand up anymore. She will never be able to run in the meadow like she used to." The innocence of her grief hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. Here was loss in its purest form, uncomplicated by adult understanding of replacement or repair. To Isabella, this was not just a broken toy, but the death of something beloved, the end of countless imaginary adventures where the pink horse had galloped through make-believe worlds. "Let me see," Nathaniel said, extending his hand. Isabella hesitated for a moment, then carefully placed the broken pieces in his palm. Her trust was complete despite her sorrow, and Nathaniel found himself handling the plastic fragments as carefully as if they were made of precious crystal. The break was clean but complex, the kind of damage that would require more than simple glue. "What was her name?" he asked, examining the horse's flowing mane and the tiny details that made it special. "Rosita," Isabella said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Mama gave her to me for my 5th birthday. She was the prettiest horse in the whole store, and Mama said she picked me specially because she knew I would love her the most." The story behind the toy made its destruction even more heartbreaking. This was not just a plaything, but a symbol of Carmen's love and sacrifice, probably purchased with money carefully saved from her modest wages. Nathaniel could imagine Carmen standing in a toy store, watching Isabella's eyes light up at the sight of the pink horse, knowing that her daughter's joy was worth whatever financial strain it might cause. "I think I might be able to help Rosita," Nathaniel said carefully. "I have some special glue in my workshop that might make her strong again. Would you like me to try?" Isabella's eyes widened with hope that was almost painful to witness. "Could you really fix her?" she asked. "You would not just be saying that to make me stop crying." The question revealed a wisdom beyond her years, the understanding that adults sometimes made empty promises to quiet children's tears. Nathaniel felt a stab of recognition, remembering how Thomas had asked similar questions when promised treats or outings that business obligations later prevented. "I cannot promise she will look exactly the same," Nathaniel said honestly, "but I promise I will try my very best to make her able to run in meadows again." Isabella considered this with the serious attention that children gave to matters of the heart. After a moment, she nodded solemnly. Rosita would not mind having a scar if it meant she could be brave and run again, she said. Mama says scars are just proof that something was hurt, but got better. The simple wisdom of her words lodged somewhere deep in Nathaniel's chest. Here was a 6-year-old girl teaching him about healing, about the beauty that could exist alongside damage, about hope that persisted even when things seemed irreparably broken. As he carefully gathered the pieces of Rosita, Nathaniel realized that for the first time in over a year, he had made a promise to someone other than himself. And for reasons he could not fully understand, keeping that promise felt more important than any contract he had ever signed. That evening, after Carmen and Isabella had gone home, Nathaniel found himself in a part of the house he had avoided for months. The workshop in the basement had been his sanctuary before the accident, a place where he could escape the demands of corporate life and work with his hands. Sarah used to joke that he ran a billion-dollar company with ruthless efficiency, but turned into a perfectionist craftsman the moment he picked up a piece of wood or a broken appliance. The space felt frozen in time, covered in a fine layer of dust that spoke of abandonment. His tools hung exactly where he had left them, organized with the precision that had once brought him peace. On the workbench sat Thomas's last project, a half-finished birdhouse that they had been building together for the backyard oak tree. The small hammer Thomas had insisted on using still lay beside it, sized perfectly for 5-year-old hands. Nathaniel forced himself to look away from the birdhouse and focus on the task at hand. He had carried Rosita's broken pieces down carefully, placing them on a clean cloth under his brightest work lamp. The fracture was more complex than he had initially thought, involving not just the leg, but a hairline crack that ran partway up the horse's body. This would require patience and precision, qualities that had once defined his approach to both business and craft. He selected his finest brush and smallest bottle of plastic cement, the kind used for delicate model repairs. As he began the painstaking process of cleaning the broken edges and preparing them for bonding, something shifted in his mind. For the first time in over a year, his thoughts were focused entirely on something other than his grief or his guilt. The work demanded complete attention, and in that focus, he found an unexpected respite from the constant ache in his chest. The repair took nearly 2 hours. Each step required careful consideration, from the initial alignment to the final smoothing of excess adhesive. Nathaniel found himself talking quietly to the plastic horse as he worked, the way he used to speak to Thomas when they were building something together. "Easy now," he murmured as he positioned the leg. "We need to make sure you are strong enough to run again." When the major structural work was complete, he faced a new challenge. The repair site was visible, a thin line where the break had occurred, and some of the pink paint had chipped away during the break. Nathaniel searched through his supplies until he found a small tin of model paint in a shade that closely matched Rosita's original color. With the finest brush he owned, he carefully touched up the damaged areas, blending the new paint with the old until the repair became nearly invisible. As the final coat dried, Nathaniel stepped back to examine his work. Rosita stood steady on all 4 legs, her flowing mane intact, her bright pink color restored. The repair was solid, strong enough to withstand the enthusiastic play of a 6-year-old girl who believed in meadows where toy horses could run free. More importantly, he had kept his promise to Isabella, had given her back something precious that had been lost. The satisfaction he felt was different from any business success he had ever achieved. This was personal and immediate, connected not to profit margins or market dominance, but to a little girl's tears and her mother's sacrifice to buy a toy that would bring joy. As he carefully wrapped Rosita in soft cloth for transport upstairs, Nathaniel realized that his hands had stopped shaking for the first time in months. The basement workshop no longer felt like a mausoleum of abandoned projects and broken dreams. For 2 hours, it had been what it was always meant to be, a place where broken things could be made whole again, where patience and care could restore what seemed permanently damaged. The half-finished birdhouse still sat on the workbench, But now it seemed less like an accusation and more like a possibility waiting for the right moment to be completed. Nathaniel climbed the basement stairs with Rosita wrapped carefully in his hands, already anticipating the moment when he could return something precious to a child who had spent the last week trying to return something precious to him. The exchange felt important in ways he was only beginning to understand, the first tentative step in a dance of healing that required both giving and receiving, both vulnerability and strength. Monday morning arrived with an anticipation that Nathaniel had not felt in over a year. He had placed Rosita carefully in a small gift box lined with tissue paper, the kind of presentation that Sarah had always insisted upon for special occasions. The repaired horse looked perfect under his office lamp, her pink coat gleaming and all four legs steady and strong. The repair line was barely visible, more like a faint beauty mark than a scar. When Carmen and Isabella arrived, Nathaniel could hear the difference in Isabella's voice immediately. The bright chatter that had been absent on Friday was back, though tempered with the careful politeness she maintained around him. She was telling her mother about something that had happened at the neighbor's house over the weekend, her words tumbling over each other with the enthusiasm that only children could sustain. Nathaniel waited until Carmen began her morning routine upstairs before approaching the kitchen. Isabella sat at her usual spot at the counter, arranging her crayons with a methodical precision he had come to recognize. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway with the small box in his hands, her eyes widened with curiosity rather than the hope he had expected. Clearly, she had accepted the loss of Rosita as final, the way children learn to do when the adult world proved unreliable. "I have something for you," Nathaniel said, crossing to the counter and setting the box beside her coloring book. Isabella looked at the box, then up at his face, searching for clues about what this unexpected gift might mean. "Is it my birthday?" she asked uncertainly. "I thought my birthday was not until next month." The question made Nathaniel smile, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in longer than he cared to remember. "No, it is not your birthday," he said. "But sometimes special things happen on regular days, too." With the careful reverence that children brought to unwrapping presents, Isabella lifted the lid of the box and folded back the tissue paper. When she saw Rosita nestled inside, her sharp intake of breath was audible throughout the kitchen. Her small hands hovered over the horse for a moment, as if she were afraid that touching might make the miracle disappear. "Rosita," she whispered, lifting the horse with infinite gentleness. "She looks exactly like she used to, only maybe even prettier." Isabella held the horse up to the light, turning her slowly to examine every angle. When her fingers found the faint repair line, she traced it with the tip of one finger, her expression thoughtful rather than disappointed. "You gave her a special mark," she said. "Now she is extra brave because she knows what it feels like to be broken and get better." The wisdom in her observation left Nathaniel momentarily speechless. This 6-year-old child had instantly understood something that had taken him months to even begin to grasp. Healing did not mean erasing the damage, but rather incorporating it into something stronger and more beautiful than what had existed before. "Thank you for fixing my Rosita," Isabella said, clutching the horse to her chest. She ran from the kitchen before he could respond, calling for Carmen in Spanish that was rapid with excitement. Nathaniel could hear her voice floating down from the upstairs hallway, animated with joy as she shared the news of Rosita's resurrection with her mother. Carmen appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, Isabella dancing around her legs with Rosita held high like a trophy. "Mr. Harrington," Carmen said, her voice thick with emotion, "you did not have to do this." She would have understood that some things cannot be fixed. "But this could be fixed," Nathaniel said simply. And she was so sad. Carmen studied his face with the careful attention of someone who recognized the significance of small gestures. "This was very kind of you," she said. "Isabella has been talking about nothing else all weekend except how much she missed her horse. You have made her very happy." Isabella had settled at her coloring station again, but now Rosita stood guard beside her crayon box, positioned where she could see her throughout the day. As she began to color, she started humming again, the same sweet melody that had become the soundtrack to Nathaniel's mornings. But now the tune seemed brighter, more complete, as if joy had been restored to its rightful place. From his office doorway, Nathaniel watched Isabella work, occasionally reaching over to touch Rosita's mane or whisper something in her ear. The simple happiness radiating from the little girl filled the kitchen with warmth that seemed to extend throughout the house, melting something frozen that Nathaniel had not even realized was there. The transformation in Isabella's behavior was immediate and profound. Where once she had moved through the house like a careful ghost, now she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had been seen and valued. The repaired Rosita became her constant companion, accompanying her to the kitchen counter each morning and standing sentinel while she worked on her drawings and coloring books. More significantly, Isabella began to talk to Nathaniel. Not the polite, whispered exchanges he had grown accustomed to, but real conversation filled with the boundless curiosity and imagination that define childhood. It started small, with observations about her artwork or questions about the interesting sounds coming from his office during conference calls. On Wednesday morning, as Nathaniel reviewed quarterly projections, Isabella appeared in his doorway with Rosita tucked under one arm and a fresh drawing in her hand. This one showed two figures, one tall and one small, standing beside what appeared to be a workbench covered with tools. "That is you fixing Rosita," she announced, pointing to the taller figure. "And that is me watching you be very careful and very smart. I drew your hands extra big because they can fix things that seem impossible to fix." The drawing was more detailed than her previous efforts, with careful attention paid to the tools scattered across the workbench, and even a tiny representation of Rosita lying in pieces before her restoration. Isabella had somehow captured not just the physical act of repair, but the emotional weight of the moment, the way something precious had been restored through patience and care. "How did you know I used tools?" Nathaniel asked, genuinely curious. "You were not in the workshop with me." Isabella's face took on the serious expression she wore when explaining something important to adults who might not understand. "I could tell by looking at Rosita when you gave her back," she said. "The fix was too perfect to be magic, so it had to be very good tools and very patient hands. Plus, Mama says you can always tell when someone really cares about fixing something because they take the time to make it beautiful again, not just strong." Her observation revealed an understanding of craftsmanship and intention that surprised him. This child had not only noticed the quality of his work, but had intuited the care behind it, recognizing that true repair involved more than simple functionality. She had seen that he had taken the time to restore Rosita's beauty along with her structural integrity. "What else do you like to fix besides horses?" Isabella asked, settling herself cross-legged on the floor beside his desk, as if this were a perfectly normal place for a 6-year-old to conduct an interview. Nathaniel found himself leaning back in his chair, abandoning the financial reports that suddenly seemed far less important than this conversation. "I used to build things with my son," he said, the words emerging before he could stop them. "Birdhouses, mostly." He liked to help, even though his hammering was not very accurate. Isabella's eyes lit up with interest rather than the discomfort that adult faces usually showed when he mentioned Thomas. "Did he like birds?" she asked. "I like birds too, especially the red ones that sing in the morning." "Do you think birds are happy when they live in houses that people make for them?" The question was so purely Isabella, combining practical curiosity with genuine concern for the well-being of creatures smaller than herself. Nathaniel considered it seriously, remembering Thomas asking similar questions as they worked together in the garage, painting each birdhouse in bright colors that would attract the most interesting varieties of backyard visitors. "I think birds appreciate safe places to raise their families," Nathaniel said, "just like people do. And I think they probably like knowing that someone cared enough to build something special just for them." Isabella nodded sagely, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "That is why Rosita is so happy now," she said. "She knows that someone cared enough to make her whole again when she was broken. She told me this morning that she feels very safe and very loved." The matter-of-fact way Isabella spoke about her toy horse's feelings might have seemed silly to another adult, but Nathaniel found himself taking her words seriously. There was wisdom in the idea that broken things, once carefully repaired, carried within them the knowledge of being valued enough to save. Perhaps healing always involved that recognition, that sense of being worth the effort required for restoration. Maybe sometime you could show me how to use tools, Isabella continued, her voice hopeful but not demanding. I would like to learn how to fix things too, in case Rosita ever needs help again, or in case I find other broken things that want to be whole. Thursday morning brought with it the weight of an anniversary that Nathaniel had been dreading for weeks. Thomas would have turned 7 today, and the date pressed against his chest like a physical force, making even simple breathing feel like an impossible task. He had tried to lose himself in work, spreading financial documents across his desk in a futile attempt to build walls against the memories. But every calculation blurred into images of birthday parties that would never happen. Carmen arrived with Isabella, as usual, but Nathaniel barely acknowledged their presence, his attention consumed by the storm of grief that threatened to pull him under entirely. From his office, he could hear Isabella's usual morning routine, the gentle arrangement of crayons and the soft rustle of coloring book pages. But today, even these sounds felt like intrusions in a world that should have been celebrating his son's existence. The breaking point came without warning. One moment he was staring at meaningless numbers on a page, and the next he was doubled over in his chair, shoulders shaking with the force of sobs that had been held back for too long. The careful control he had maintained for over a year crumbled like a dam bursting, releasing torrents of grief that left him gasping and raw. He did not hear Isabella's soft footsteps approaching his office, did not notice her small form appearing in the doorway, until she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Nathaniel, are you very sad today?" Through his tears, he saw her standing just inside the doorway, clutching something brown and fuzzy against her chest. Her dark eyes were wide with concern, but held no fear, only the instinctive compassion that children possessed when faced with adult pain they might not understand but could certainly recognize. "I am sorry, Isabella," he managed to say, wiping his face with shaking hands. "I did not mean for you to see me like this." But instead of retreating, Isabella moved closer, her bare feet making no sound against the hardwood floor. "It is okay to be sad," she said simply. "Mama says that sometimes our hearts get so full of missing someone that the sadness has to come out or we might burst like a balloon." She stopped just beside his chair, and Nathaniel could see that the fuzzy brown object in her arms was a teddy bear, well worn from countless nights of comfort and clearly treasured beyond measure. The bear's fur was matted in places from being held too tightly, and one of its button eyes was slightly loose, giving it an endearingly lopsided expression. "This is Oso," Isabella said, holding the bear toward him. "He helps me when I feel scared or when I miss my papa, even though I never met him. Mama gave him to me when I was very little, and he knows all my secrets and all my worries. Maybe he could help you too, just for a little while." The offer was so pure, so generous, that it took Nathaniel's breath away. This child was offering him her most precious possession, the comfort object that had seen her through every difficult night and frightening moment of her young life. The teddy bear represented safety and love and the kind of security that could not be purchased or earned, only given freely from one heart to another. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying, "I cannot take your bear. He belongs with you." But Isabella stepped closer, gently placing Oso in Nathaniel's hands with the solemnity of someone entrusting another person with something invaluable. "He is very good at making sad people feel less alone," she said. "And right now, you look like you need him more than I do." The teddy bear was warm from being held against Isabella's chest, and it carried the faint scent of children's shampoo and innocent dreams. As Nathaniel's fingers closed around the soft fur, something fundamental shifted inside him. For the first time since losing Thomas and Sarah, he was not alone with his grief. This small girl had seen his pain and responded not with empty words or uncomfortable silence, but with the most meaningful gift she could offer, Without thinking, he pulled Isabella into a gentle embrace. The teddy bear pressed between them like a bridge connecting their separate sorrows. She came willingly, her small arms wrapping around his neck with the fierce tenderness that children reserve for those they had decided to protect. Together they sat in the quiet office, sharing a moment of healing that had nothing to do with forgetting the past and everything to do with believing in the possibility of tomorrow. 6 months later, the basement workshop hummed with purposeful activity for the first time in over a year. Nathaniel guided Isabella's small hands as she carefully sanded the smooth curves of a birdhouse wall, her tongue poking out in concentration, just as Thomas's used to do. Carmen watched from the bottom of the stairs, a warm smile playing across her face as she witnessed the unlikely partnership that had transformed both their lives. The Sarah and Thomas Harrington Foundation had officially launched the previous month, with Carmen as its director and Isabella as its youngest inspiration. The foundation provided scholarships for children who had lost parents, funded grief counseling programs, and most recently, had begun sponsoring community workshops where adults and children could learn to build things together. The basement that had once been a tomb of abandoned projects now served as the prototype for healing spaces that would soon exist in community centers across the city. "That is perfect," Isabella, Nathaniel said as she finished sanding her section. "Your birdhouse is going to be the most beautiful home for a very lucky family of birds." Isabella beamed with pride, carefully setting down her sandpaper and examining her work with the critical eye of a master craftsman. "Do you think the baby birds will like the yellow paint we picked out?" she asked. "I thought yellow would remind them of sunshine, even on cloudy days." The question was so perfectly Isabella, combining practical concern with poetic wisdom. Over the past months, Nathaniel had learned to see the world through her eyes, finding magic in small details and hope in everyday moments. Her presence in his life had not erased the pain of losing Thomas and Sarah, but had taught him that love shared multiplied rather than diminished, and that healing could happen alongside remembrance rather than in spite of it. Carmen joined them at the workbench, running her fingers along the smooth wood with appreciation. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "you have created something very special here. Not just the foundation, but this space where broken hearts can learn to build again." The workshop had indeed become something special. Every Saturday morning, it filled with the sounds of children and adults working together, some building birdhouses, others repairing treasured toys, or creating new memories from simple materials. The half-finished birdhouse that Thomas had started still sat in a place of honor on the main shelf, no longer a symbol of loss, but a reminder that love continued even when projects remained incomplete. Isabella had become the unofficial ambassador of the program, her natural empathy and wisdom helping other children navigate their own experiences with loss and healing. She had a gift for seeing past adult facades to the hurt underneath, offering comfort with the same generous spirit that had once prompted her to slide drawings under his office door. Oso still lived on Isabella's bed, but he had made several more visits to Nathaniel during particularly difficult days, always delivered with the same ceremonial gravity that had marked their first meeting. Each time, Isabella would explain that Oso had specifically requested to help with whatever sadness needed attention, as if the worn teddy bear had developed a calling for therapeutic work. As they cleaned up the workshop at the end of their session, Isabella presented Nathaniel with a new drawing, this one showing the three of them standing in front of a house made entirely of birdhouses with dozens of colorful birds flying overhead. At the bottom, in her careful print, she had written the place where broken things learn to fly again. The image captured something essential about what they had built together, this unlikely family bound not by blood, but by shared understanding of loss and the courage to love again. The foundation would help thousands of children and families, but its real success would always be measured in moments like this, when a grieving man and a wise little girl discovered that healing happened not through forgetting, but through opening their hearts wide enough to hold both sorrow and joy. As they walked upstairs together, Isabella's small hand tucked trustingly into his, Nathaniel realized that Thomas and Sarah lived on not in the silence of a museum house, but in the laughter and love that filled these walls again. If this story touched your heart, please drop a comment and let us know about a time when a child's innocent wisdom helped you see the world differently, or share your favorite moment from Nathaniel and Isabella's journey toward healing.